Hi, Mel.
Hi, Danielle.
How are you today?
Well, just started to settle a bit, considering that the topic we're talking about today is fairly relevant. But yeah, not too bad, thanks.
That's good. That's good. I'm doing fantastic. And so I just want to lead us into what it is that our topic's going to be today. And that is going to be in our newest series that we've created called it for the mental health and well-being. And today we are talking stress, what stress is, why we have it, what's the purpose behind it, the impact this has on our daily existence, the consequences of short term stress and long term stress, and then some techniques and considerations to have while we're dealing with stress. Now, before we get into this topic fully, I did want to request that all of our listeners like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us get more views from more people because what we're trying to do is spread the word. And this really allows us to be put in front of a broader audience. So, with that being said, let's talk stress today, Mel.
Okay, so as we talked before in the introduction to mental health and wellbeing series, is that mental health, in terms of what we experience, will exist on the continuum. So people will experience a variety of things like anxiety, stress, panic, and without it meaning that they have any kind of disorder and need to necessarily get treatment for it. But I felt it was important to start with stress because actually stress often predisposes us to a whole range of health and mental health issues if something is prolonged. So by covering some of the sort of basics of stress today and helping people think about some of the things that helps them cope, in particular with everything that's going on, around the world, whatever. I know we've got a lot of listeners in the US and we've got them in the UK. And mental health is experienced in lots of different ways, but it hasn't got boundaries, class or race or culture. Everybody will experience stress on some degree. And I think if we talk about stress in different groups, people have generally a good understanding about what that means and how it might affect them, but they don't necessarily realise some of the core components of that and some of the things that we can either do once a crisis is sort of out the way. Because when we're in a crisis, it's a different response, even though we will look at how the brain responds to stress generally. So we look at initially what is stress. So for some people, it can feel like a mental state. For some, it can feel like a physiological state. For some, it's all sorts of different feelings. But really, it's a state that's defined that when an individual perceives that demands that are placed on them exceed their capacity to cope. So that is a subjective experience about what they're experiencing in that moment or over the course of those days or over the course of the months. Things like anxiety, depression and stress is the number one health problem around the globe, and yet only a few people really go and ever seek help or get the right help that they need. And on a later edition, when we look at the the mental health series, I want to cover the different types of help that's available to help people think about what they might need right now in the moment and what could help them, because the support that you get through grief and the support that you get in stress can be different, and people need different things at different stages of their life journey. So as a general consequence of stress, 40 million work days are lost every year in the UK every day due to stress. So every day they're reckoned, and my paper might be a little bit out of date, but this is still startling figures. 270,000 people per day take time off for stress. Now, I'm talking about the UK. The UK is barely the size of one of your states.
Right.
So, if you think about in terms of those numbers and multiply that many times, we have got a huge issue generally.
Yeah. This is like category 4 or 5, like this is high need to be evaluated, looked at and talked about, because everybody is going through some form of stress. Yeah. And the more we can be aware and be thoughtful that everybody's kind of fighting these same perceived demons, the more we're going to get ahead in this process, instead of hiding it and saying, no, I'm not stressed, no, I can do this, and allowing that that information to come forward so that we can, handle the stress, because stress is part of society as we know it now. And so how we take on stress is a key into how successful we're going to be within ourselves. And then obviously that reflects into the display around everybody.
Well, and I think the key point you're making there is people don't realize that that stress itself is a process of, that we have access to as humans that helps us adapt. And so when things change, or when there's a crisis, or there's an emergency situation, stress is actually what gives us the fuel and power to respond in the best way that's needed for that particular time. So if you're a policeman, a firefighter, or you're working on the hard line in services, then a certain amount of stress is what gives you the energy and the motivation to adapt to that situation. The issue comes in is in the intermediate, in the short term, the adaptive process and stress itself is vital. In the longer term, and there's lots of reasons why it stays longer term, the demands that it places on the body not only affects the mental health, but affects the physical health as well. And so stress is really just created, it's a biological process that gives us what we need to respond initially to emergency reaction. And so that's why, we need to normalize that this is a normal process in the body, but it's often about what tools do we need to tap into that helps us manage that short-term issue and then longer-term issues. So on a biological level, when we start to feel stress, the fuel reserves in our body are mobilized and sent to the brain and muscles. But also what we find is parts of our body will shut down because the energy is moved away from there. So the body can be at its optimum with the energy reserves that it's got, which is often the idea of why we carry some fat to some degree. So we've got those reserves. But things like digestive processes slow down. So that's why longer time, or over the course of longer term, that constant experience of being in stress, we will start to notice that we will have breathing problems, we'll have digestive problems, we'll have sleep problems. And so it's really key that when we're thinking about mental health, that we are taking those things into account. Is what else is it we're experiencing? In terms of stress as an adaptive process, is once you've been through that stressfully mental cycle, it's a bit like we've talked about before. You go to the gym and you have all these demands placed on your body because you've either been running or rowing and lifting weights. And the body, then it's about how resilient are you in order to cope with the demands that's been placed on you and then recover. And so it's the cycle of demands and then recovery, and demand and recovery. And one of the books that I was reading today, just to sort of catch up on this, is that as humans, we've evolved, and the technological and the industrial advancements have evolved so far that in a way we haven't learned how to adapt enough to be able to cope with the demands that is placed on us on a day-to-day basis, let alone the fact that things like the 9-to-5 schedule really is out of date and needs to be reviewed, and that we need to work with our rhythms in our body rather than the way that the work is set up, and that we need to get better sleep. And so how do we do that? We don't keep the laptop on and have the blue light shining in our eyes, because research has showed us this is still stimulating our system. And so we've got overstimulated nervous systems, and that's before we even look at the trauma that maybe people have experienced, that will make them more likely to have or be exposed to things that trigger them more on a day-to-day basis. So you haven't just got the short-term stress, you'll be having things that already exist within, the psyche or the body of that person.
Yeah, that actually makes, especially when you're talking about the blue light effect from having, we talk about this technological revolution that we're inside of. Well, this is the equivalent of the Wild West for us. We don't know. And we're learning as we go. We're learning what works and what doesn't. And if our bodies, we have this handheld device, right? And it's
Yeah.
a natural addiction. It's something to keep our brains moving. It's something to keep us entertained. It's something to connect us. And so we have this tendency to constantly have it in front of us. And without the realization, because we're still learning, that a lot of your stress and time management comes from learning what's effective and what's not in front of that screen time. And as much as I am obviously we're firm believers in the technology, we're
Mm.
showing that as we speak, but having a responsibility to yourself and your well-being at putting the phone down or turning off the computer or shutting the laptop up, not playing, not watching TV until you fall asleep, allowing yourself to get into that new zone really has helped me on a personal level with my stress and how I
Mm.
intake, and that my body did need that the rest in that way, even if I wasn't asleep. Having no screen time for certain amounts of time has really helped me adjust back into not only this reality, but that handling the stresses of this reality,
Mm.
knowing that that is a separate reality. Everything online is separate, and allowing that to occur for me. So yeah, I'm just felt like bringing that up.
And you're right. And I think one of the things in terms of thinking about stress and how its immediate impact affects us, means that the day-to-day things that we do that could also be adding to the overstimulation of our brain and bodies anyway are much harder to detect and discern when we're in high stakes of stress. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit on a really basic sort of level what is happening when we start to experience stress. So if we were going back to the days of where we all lived in caves, female or male, and a dinosaur comes around the corner, well, your body would be kicking in terms of fight or flight. So you'd start to experience a cascade of chemicals going through your system as your brain and body are working out in split seconds whether or not that dinosaur is going to be causing you, going to hunt you down and trying to eat you, or whether or not you're going to fight the dinosaur, or you're going to lay on the floor and freeze. So this is a very primitive response that comes from the lower part of the brain, which is one of the first parts of the brain to develop in the fetus with the baby. And it's the primitive responses that help us survive. So it is in charge of our the way that our body works, the way that we experience heat and cold and those initial responses. So we'll get flooded with all those chemicals, and those chemicals are designed to get our bodies moving. And this is where sometimes in history you see people have achieved massive feats because they've got these stress chemicals coursing through their system. And then what will happen is you'll have those biological processes, but you might not be aware of all this.
Right.
And as you start to, especially if it's crises, something happens, can either throw you into the shock, or you're walking out on the street and a car passes you really quick, or someone jumps out on you, or you've had news, you walk into work and you've had news that you're sacked, so you haven't got the job anymore. These things can evoke that stress response. And
Right.
so what's happening is, in that moment, if you're in crises, your amygdala, the lower part of your brain, is activated and all the chemicals are coming out. But the top part of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex that is responsible for thinking, reflecting and observing, has less use in this, because you're not going to sit there and sort of think, okay, what am I going to do about this? You're normally reacting to the fast flight of chemicals in your system, because your body and brain is going run, fight or freeze.
Right.
And the freeze is a sort of response that is less discussed in circles.
Yeah.
But where children have experienced trauma, for example, in their childhood and as they grow up in teens, it can be a total shutdown of the system. So it can actually look like not much is going on, but actually the whole system has gone into shutdown and it can't cope. And it's a way, it's almost like, I think we've seen dogs do this. They might just lie, or animals just lie there. They're being attacked and they lie there and they don't move. They're immobilized. And
Right.
interestingly, I have seen this in work environments. Some people fight, shout, argue, rail up, some people run, they don't want to know, it's over there, I'm getting myself out of that space, and it's
Right.
the body that is deciding that. And some people just have lost, either it's been long and enduring and they haven't got the capacity anymore, and so they start to shut down. And I've seen that in very toxic work environments.
Yeah.
So that process is natural, and I don't know about you, Danielle, but I've certainly experienced that many times.
Absolutely. And I've had all three versions of this fight, flight, or freeze, you know, and I think it depends on not only what your triggers, your stress points are,
Yeah.
right? But it also is the level of endurance. I've always been a leaning towards the fight side of this. And we actually did a topic that we kind of got into an open discussion about fight, flight, or freeze.
Great.
And I don't
Yeah.
remember if it was the letting go episode or the empowerment episode, but either way, um, when I became so overwhelmed with the world and I wasn't attacking, you know, because that's what we feel like we have to do is attack the problem, attack the problem. What's the stressor?
Mhm.
What's the stressor? And I had just let it all, I couldn't do it anymore, is when I began to freeze. And in those freezing moments, you feel very out of control. You feel very, you know, not able to take care of your body's response systems, and that's a scary place to be, which is probably why we don't talk the freeze talk very often, is because people don't want to acknowledge that your body can go into an automatic shutdown over levels of stress. And we see that, you know, I kind of have a little picture of the fainting goats in my head, you know,
Mm.
when we freeze, like, oh my gosh, it's an overload on the body and it sends you into this moment of just, you could just fall down. And, you know, stress being long term, I could really see that when a person hits these new levels of stress and they've been enduring them, that your body just has no more fight left, because you're automatically your body's in this moment at all times,
Yeah.
that it's worn out, it's depleted, that we haven't been addressing the stress issues in our life. And in the moment that you freeze and you can't do anything, is your
Yeah.
body really screaming at you, please, please take me out of this survival mode and put me into a different mode, so that when we have these stressful things happen to us, we're able to respond accordingly. Because it is, although it is something that's innate in us, it's from our ancestors, it's just a core value that we have. It is our job as an evolved human to take control over these aspects and learn to go beyond the survival response. And, you know, that's part of what you and I have been talking about this whole time, is how do we get beyond survival into a thriving response? And because when you stand and thrive, you have a new perspective and you can handle, you've moved into the center of the wheel. You're no longer on the roller coaster ride. And so it's easier for us to acknowledge our stress, take on the stress, and take it from this caveman, you know, response, and say, wait, I feel the initial response, but how should I handle this? And
Mm.
you're able to transition into that through the thrive part of our existence right now.
So that's what sort of creates difference between different people. So the innate response is what everybody experiences.
Right.
Anyone who's in a crisis will, whether they're aware of it or not, be releasing those stress chemicals in their system as the system itself prepares to fight, flight, or freeze. And some of the points that you made is then what demarcates it for different people in terms of their experience of that. Because one is, what's their view of stress? Did they realize it's normal? What kind of stresses have they already faced in their life? And did they learn that they had gathered some tools and resources in their toolboxes to cope? Or are the current demands that are placed on them, which can happen in a new job, for example, where you're elevated in terms of, you know, you might have gone from a worker to a manager, and now you're in a new learning zone, but now your whole competencies and skills come into question, because you were very good at the job you did before, and you've obviously got the skills to do this job, but the transition itself can be really daunting and create stress as you move through that transition. And the key thing also is that, as you rightly say, is about perceived control. So one of the things that's come out of some of the, just touching on the research, in some of the things I've read, is that people who have issues with pain and they're looking at pain management, older people who were moving out their own accommodation into maybe an older person's setting, or even people who go in for surgery, surgeons say that they know if a patient says, I've been dreading this operation all day, that some surgeons won't even follow through with the operation because they know that the stress will place the body under so much stress in that operation that they're going to do much worse than people who go into that with a different mindset. And in terms of older people and pain management, is when people perceive that they've got some control in some way. And actually, one of the organisations that I worked with called the Human Givens, they talk about basic human needs. And one of the way in terms of mental health, you can start to understand why you're starting to have some difficulties, is that all humans have needs. And so one of the first things to do as well, not when you're in crisis, so let's move away from, we've been in a crisis, we've had the stress response, and now we're getting back to some homeostasis, we're getting back to some even keel. But the idea is that if we're experiencing some anxiety or depression or some stress, it's our system telling us that something is off key, or that we're responding in outdated ways, and we need to check that. But our perceived control over our environment, our experience, is key to this, because where it actually some people fare worse is if they've got negative mindsets and are quite pessimistic. So you sort of need an optimistic mindset, as well as understanding how you function and all the things that can affect you.
Now, does it need to be optimistic, or can we sit in neutrality when this is happening? It's a genuine question because I'm not sure. Is neutrality an option for those who normally have this negative mindset? If they reach neutrality, are they going to find a better level to handle stress?
So because most things are polarized, and a lot of people experience things in terms of really stressed or optimistic and pessimistic are usually the two levels. Of course, is neutrality, but even for people who meditate every day and are very mindful and aware of the thoughts that pass through their heads, we grow up in a society where, you know, celebrating things that are good, bringing out your own gifts and abilities, and finding out what your own path and purpose in life is not actually sort of brought out of people or celebrated.
No, it's not celebrated. Yeah. In fact, it's the opposite. We call them, you know, they're bragging, or they have to be the center of attention, or, you know, attach whatever negative to you trying to be your positive self. And that's just really the conditioning that is society, that if we're not the best of the best of the best, then you have no room to brag. You have no room to be proud of yourself, or to even, you know, I remember somebody asked me when we first started this podcast, I never met this person. And they were like, what are you doing for a living? You know, our basic question asking. And I told him I was very excited. I've started this podcast. I'm working really hard. We talk, you know, about this. I've got a mental health professional that helps with all of this. And he looked me dead in the eyes and said, humble brag, I guess. And I was like, who are you talking to? Like, you asked me what I'm doing, and I'm excited about what I'm doing. Therefore, I'm not bragging. And even if I were bragging, I have the right to do so because I took a lot of time and effort to get to this place that I get to be proud of myself. And I just, you know, that stuck out, the way he told me I was bragging because I was proud of what I was doing. And that is how that the polarity of what we, you know, that we are asked to be, you know, to strive to do the best of what we can. But then we're also told that we're not supposed to celebrate that. You know, and then we make fun of the culture being, you know, the participation medal, the participation trophy, right? Like, that's something to be made fun of. It's not. Everybody deserves to be acknowledged for even getting up and participating.
Yeah. Well, and this is where it gets deeper, because sometimes, so there's external stress and there's internal stress. So external stress can be that your car's broken down, you've lost your job. And so we looked at the big stressors that most people know this, but the top one is death of a spouse, divorce, marital separation, going into prison, personal injury, marriage, and the list goes on. But as you go further down the list, we start to see that things that relate to change will also create some stress. So changing your habits, changing residence, changing schools, changing personal habits, living conditions. So the change itself can also bring on stress in, and your body can start to go into survival mode because it perceives the change as a threat. Now, if part of that change is linked to what you were saying, which is, we grow up in an environment in the families that we're in, and we're lucky if we can pretty much develop our own nature and free spirit within that framework, that environment, that religion, that culture. And then we go to a school that we have to sort of box ourselves into some degree. And only about 60 or 70% of children are naturally inclined to learn in that way anyway. And so some of the stress can come because we're not learning in a way that we innately learn. If you're an auditory learner and the teacher is talking in visual language and teach you in visual methodology, we know already there's a disconnect. So that will create stress. If you go and work in an environment where actually you've only ever really wanted to, are you still there, Danielle?
I'm still here. I don't have your, I just have your pretty picture up.
Right. Okay. Bear with me. We've had some technical issues. I've lost.
But in the meantime, yeah, exactly what you're saying. It really is, part of how we are formed from childhood on is a lot of the way we receive our family stress, or the way our friends stress. We are always taking these things in, and sometimes they stick, and now we're like, this is how I handle stress, because even though it's an unconscious thing, we are still picking up on other people and the way that they're handling. This is, the beauty of human life is we kind of pattern each other around each other. And then, so when we're talking stress, welcome back. I see you again. when we are conditioned in these ways of, like
stressful there.
right. Well, for example, like the way my dad handled his stress and the way my mom handled her stress was completely different than how I'm choosing to handle my stress. But naturally, conditioned unconsciously, I was mirroring the way they stressed, and I was mirroring that in my daily habits, how I handled the stressors, how I would receive and then put back out the projection of the stress. And we are just mirrors to everybody else. So who we choose, who we don't choose, as like our parents and the family we grew up in, can make this really big impact on your response to stress. And where I'm not using this as a victim standpoint, I call it a bell curve, right? So that's where you started out on this curve. How do you get yourself to a different level on this stress point? Because we are in control of the way we handle things, and we are quite capable of, I'm living proof of the way I once handled stress versus how I handle stress now. You can override that system. We're all quite capable of it. And even if your initial response is that fight, flight, or freeze, you also have this beautiful brain going on that can override that and say, wait, we've been here before. That way didn't work. So let's create a new pathway that will be more feasible for not only your well-being, but everybody else's well-being around you. How can we do this? And so, stress is a scary thing, but at the same time, if you can get control over your stress, you are mastering a very difficult space in the human existence.
Yeah, and talking about childhood was a really key point as well, because as you rightly say, when a child grows up in a family, whether it's mom, dad, aunts, uncles, however they manage their response to the issues that are going on in their lives, whether it is they owe money, there are work issues, that will be modelled by the children to some degree, where either they learn to shut down and not express themselves, but will feel the stress on an internal level, or they will lash out and fight. And that's the thing, you see, sometimes, and because stress can actually be quite a strong experience of chemicals coursing through your system, just like with anger, people can get addicted to the experience of that themselves.
Yeah.
And in terms of, so I've gone through a couple of really stressful periods in my life, and two of them were at work. And as much as I had a lot of tools and resources at my disposal, some of the things that I was realizing in hindsight, because as you say, hindsight is great, but at the time we don't necessarily have access to it because we get in that state. What I'd started to notice was I actually got, you can get into the state where you are stressed every day and your system is constantly wired to the point that I was releasing so much stress chemicals that I could function, but I was burnt out. So it was a weird experience of functioning every day and doing the job and focusing on what I was doing, but at the same time I was absolutely exhausted. And there will often come a crunch point for people if they don't notice the signs and where things are going in that direction. So I know now, if I've had a long day, I get overtired, I can start to drop things, and that's an indicator for me to stop and get some time out. So you've got to be able to also understand how you learn about stress, how you learn to handle your emotions and regulate them, how you respond to. So some people won't get that stress until, I don't know, something big like losing a job or getting notice on the house. Other people can get stressed because it's raining outside and they can't find an umbrella, you know. And so that's kind of like the times in which we need to be looking at, okay, what's going on for this? And why is this so stressful?
Well, part of what used to stress me out was time and being somewhere on time. And if I wasn't somewhere on time, or if we had the potential of not being there on time, even if I knew that being on time wasn't the important part, it still was a stress point for me. And I would project in anger, like, hurry up, and like, we're not being respectful of another person's time, and you just would it would stress me to no end. And then I would find myself having a hard time releasing, where when I got there, of course I was on time because I didn't need to stress about that. I would already be in such these high these volatile feelings, I guess would be the way I would put that. It would be so, the slightest thing could send me over the edge. And that was because I would keep breathing in the stress and finding that stressful period, because then I'd be awake at least, and so it does become that addiction. At least I'm awake, at least I'm feeling something, because I was feeling a lot of nothing in those time frames. And so when you feel something for the first time, be it anger, sadness, whatever, at least you're feeling, at least you're having an opportunity to feel it. And so stress can be an addiction itself. You can be addicted to the feelings that it promotes for you, because at least you're in a process of feeling. And although it's not healthy for you to get stressed over things that you can't control, like say the weather, right? And it's easy to then fall into the need to control in those arenas. And a lot of the stress is coming up because we feel the need to control our environment and how it responds to us, and how I always say leave the center of the wheel. You get on that roller coaster ride because that roller coaster ride is providing you some kind of experience that you wouldn't be otherwise having, because we're not taking the time to stop and enter the space that is needed to tackle stress in the way that we are deserving to tackle stress.
So sometimes things escalate and speed up because the energy of the situation requires it, and it's our resistance and ways of controlling things from our previous experiences that can be the things that get in the way. So rather than free floating through it, so it's a bit like if you move in house and get married, you know, there's certain things to do, but if you sit there and procrastinate, they all build up and you can start to feel overwhelmed. Then you can have the opposite, like what I was saying, that in work I was going, and the signs then in terms of where that way of living your life start to kick in is then if you are getting overly emotional over very small things. So I could get overly emotional because there was still washing up in the sink, you know, but it would just be one more thing that I'd go, oh.
Exactly. And that's always how it feels. It's like almost like a domino effect, you know, once you're already in the zone of stress, which
Yeah,
you live in
and then
this reality, you've been there, you know,
yeah,
the
and after
smallest
6
inconvenience can send you into fight or flight.
right off. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And even and one of the difficulties is if the stress has been going on, because really reactive stress should be over and done with in a few days or a few weeks, but if it's been prolonged, so you're living on the adrenaline and you don't realize, you just at it, you know, you keep going at it. Normally you only realize once you go on holiday, you realize that for the first week you're so exhausted you don't want to go out and explore. But when you're emotional like that, or easily getting emotional, especially if you're not usually an emotional person, if you find that you're waking up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and the reason for that is actually the brain has a job when you're asleep, because the brain has to process all of the information that's come in at it on a day-to-day basis. If you're overwhelmed with stress, your brain hasn't got the capacity to cope with all the incoming information. So then that's when it starts doing it in dreams. So the dream state is the body and the brain's natural mechanism in which to process all the information that it's experiencing.
Yeah.
But if you start waking up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, now some people do because they want to meditate and it's the time that the sun is rising and that feels right, that's different. But if you're waking up with loads of ideas in your head or having conversations that, you know, you may have started the day before and you are exhausted and you're waking up out of a scary, demanding, challenging dream, then these would be the signs that actually you are, you know, if you had to look at, you're feeling all right and you're really stressed over here, you are moving right over into the stress zone, and this is where the red flags go up. And for me it'd be things like tripping up, forgetting my keys, writing on bits of paper, as you know, I can be a little bit chaotic, but it gets even more chaotic, not remembering things. And if you know yourself quite well, you might notice what some of those triggers are, and then it's about what's important then. So what we're going to look at as well is some of the key things that can help once you understand how you experience stress. So the first question is, how do you experience stress? Then it's, what other events in your life have been stressful? And is it like what you said, Danielle, that in some of them you ran, in other of them you fought or got angry, and in others you rolled back and couldn't respond at all?
Just shut
because
down.
people may find, because people might find, and it's really bizarre because I've had all three as well, and it wasn't a conscious choice to go, I think I'll do it like that way in comparison to that way. And often it's your intuition and your innate capacity to survive will kick in. So have a look at, and also think about, where have you made changes in your life that at the time were incredibly stressful? But what were the tools and resources that you harnessed and utilized? Did you talk to a friend? Did you go and see a therapist? Did you have some time out and go to a spa? Did you practice mindfulness and meditation? Did you scream and shout? Did you write a letter? What were the things that you did when you experienced stress, and as you started to move through it, that actually seemed to work? Because some of those will still apply, and sometimes we've got to add things on top, because underneath the stress, sometimes, as you said, you were starting to move in towards anxiety. Now, anxiety is a component, but also separate, because you can feel anxious and not stressed. But that can, if you are an anxious person, it can feed into the stress, because what anxiety is often about is you're trying to predict the uncertain future, and it creates a lot of unease, because it's very hard to do that. Or you're working on all the what ifs, but the what ifs are from that negative mindset, not from the what could be beautiful mindset. and very few people, I don't know what the percentage is, but based on our cultural influences, are much more likely to look at what could go wrong and disasters, because we've had several world wars, you know, we've had Cold Wars, we've had all these things happening in politics, and now we're having, you know, a global pandemic. Well, of course, the future is uncertain, which is what is driving us to want to talk about mental health and well-being, because how do you sustain yourself in times like this? How do you stay in the center of the wheel? And I love that metaphor, because I often have felt this chaos around me, a bit like the Charlie Brown character.
Who
I can't remember his
stinky.
Yeah, he drags his blanket.
It's funny because as you were talking, I drew, like, this is how I viewed stress, right? You're the center point, or you're the circle, right? And if you remain in the center, this stress almost doesn't penetrate. But the more we exit over here to the edges and start to find out why all these stresses, like what, you know, reaction to all the stresses, when the chaos, it's like the chaotic lines all around you. And the more you can return to your center, the more you can focus on what you can control, and at the same time releasing those things that you cannot control, you'll find yourself slowly entering the center of the wheel, and much less affects you, much less you're able to cope with stress in the ways that our body is designed to, without putting any more pressure on it or consistency in that zone. Because although I respect stress as what it is, I have, you know, a lot of respect for the reason we have it, the purpose behind it. I do know that stress isn't like any emotion. Stress is not something to live inside of. It is not a place to reside. It is not a place to unpack your bags in. And although you don't have to go running from stress, it really is a great indicator in the way that you're receiving stress and how you're putting that back out, like you had said earlier, to really take note of that. Because inside of that is a message, and inside of that message is a cure to help heal that aspect of yourself. And the more we come into contact of ourselves and our self-awareness, and say without judgment, without judging ourselves, this is how I respond to stress. There's no judgment behind that. This is just how you respond to stress. Okay, this is how I respond. Now, how do I make the changes so that maybe my initial response says, yes, continue that path that you've always done, but maybe my new override can say, is this within my control, right? How can I respond in this moment? And I don't mean these external stressors like there was just a car accident. I don't mean that. I mean in our day-to-day activity stress, our work life, our home life, the things that we add to our plate every day because it's the society we live in now. You know, what can I do to help me release these perceived controls that don't exist? And you'd be amazed at how quickly the stress points start to soften.
Yeah, so I was thinking as you were talking of giving some examples of the common stresses that I've come across. Because I think when people can relate to the stories, they might realize actually, because there's so many different ways that stress can manifest. Stress can manifest even if you lay in your bed doing nothing. You know, because we can all wind ourselves up or replay situations that were stressful at the time. Because as we've said before, the brain can't distinguish between really what's fact and, you know, what's reality and what is a vision in your head. So I'm going to think of some examples. So whoever's caretaking the children. So if we're thinking of, say it's mom and she's at home and she's got some little ones. So she's got a couple of kids under 5. And maybe was a career woman and has now got children, and one of the kids is sick and is sick a lot. So she's traveling from doctors, she's up at night, the child is experiencing symptoms, but nobody can really pin their finger on that, as well as the day-to-day stuff of getting the kids in the car to the shops in the day without the traffic, without all of those things. So on a very basic level, being at home with the kids, for example, like that, without all of the other sessions that you want to get them introduced to, like piano or ballet or reading or jamborees or going down to the park and all of these things that we organise in our lives that we add on top of the day-to-day things. Some people will rise to that and flow through that and take it all under the wing, and you'll hear phrases like that. and other people will be able to do a proportion of it, and then it gets too much. So at that point, it the stopping point and the capacity to reflect is important, but you've got to create the space to do it.
Right.
Let's take a different example. So you work in an environment and you've maybe worked somewhere for a few years, and you've been promoted and everybody recognizes what skills you've got. You're excited, you're getting a pay rise, you're telling everybody, and then the reality is on Monday morning, you've got these emails coming through using words you've not recognized before, asking you to go to meetings you've never been to talk to people in the meetings or on Teams, and you struggle to manage tech, or you've been asked to write a report and you don't really know whether or not how to do that. What are the kind of things that go through people's minds? Can I do it? I've never done that before. I'm rubbish at writing reports. I wish I wouldn't have taken this job. I was excited for it. What we're taking on. And people won't necessarily realize that both, whether you've got the young children and you're moving through those spaces with children, or you've taken that new job on, that you're going through a transition. You're going through the model of who you were and you're going through a growth spurt. So the stress itself is releasing the chemicals because your body's going, I don't know what's happening here. But that can be short term and it can be temporary, because the key component for both those people is to look at what their needs are. So if you go into the work environment, it might be that you need a coach or a peer mentor that can support you through that process. You need to be able to trust people. You need to be able to ask that it's okay, because it's quite normal when you're going through a growth spurt that you need some support, because you're developing new competencies and skills. If you're a parent, it might be that you get someone over so you can just have some sleep, or that you have a partner that cooks for you sometimes, or that you shop online and you don't get it delivered, or you take the pressure off yourself to have a house that looks like a shiny new pin. So some of that is external demands, but the internal demands will be our ways of viewing that, our internal dialogue will certainly feed into that. So there are lots of different, if you're in a crisis, if someone's just died in the family, or there is a car accident, that's happened, and you've got to go out and assist in that stress will help you stay focused and alert.
Yeah.
But you've also got to have good emotional regulation so that you don't overspill. So a lot of people in emergency services may feel all those things, but they harness it enough so that they can remain focused and support
They
those.
override that a survival aspect of it. They override it and have created the new pathway that allows them to remain focused and use that stress to their benefit as opposed to their detriment. And that's kind of what my whole point has been this time, is like, we do have this level of control over ourselves, and it's easy inside of a very stressful, as a person who has done it themselves, inside of stressful, long-term enduring stress, to become the victim of it and forget who you are and the power you hold. And, when we're transitioning environments, that what you had referred to as the positive or the negative mindset will change your existence. If you decide to step into a new transitionary period of, work, or, like a new job, a new home, bringing a baby into the house, if we can step into this and have a more positive outlook. Like I might not know what I'm doing as a first-time mom, or inside of this new job field, or I don't know if my neighbors are going to be nice. I can at least say I have high hopes that this is all going to work in my favor, and that and everything I'm doing is going to be in a good place for me, because I made these choices in some form intuitively, and I'm going to need to up the ante by having a positive thought process to get to that next space. And it's really important that we know that we have that level of control. And then, as you were talking about keeping the perfect home, look, guys, if some people, it relieves stress to clean. For me, it brings up stress to clean. It's just the way I respond to, this world. And when I stopped comparing myself to how
Yeah.
everybody else lives, or how I see it in the television shows, or how I'm reading it in the magazines. I realized that that level of stress was so unnecessary. And I had to let go of the perfectionism of
Yeah.
keeping the house at this certain visual level that I had,
Yeah.
and let go of that need to control that, and just have like a consistency. And it really changed how I'm able to keep my household, looking the way I personally want it to look, without having that level of stress eating away at me at all times to keep it up the way I envisioned it should be.
But you're highlighting some of the key components as well, is what the expectations we have of ourselves and what we think people have of us. And people do compare and contrast, and people do question how you live your day, and and how you dress your kids and all of those. And we're often exposed to the sort of social gaze, which adds to that pressure. So
Yes.
you've got to be quite a strong and hardy person, or get to the point where, and often people do get to crises, and I've had burnout a couple of times because I've not recognized the signs in my body. I've not had the support sometimes necessary in order to do the job and take my foot off the gas. And what can happen, and this is the downside of prolonged stress: in the short term, it's good, it gets us mobile, and it gives us what we need in order to do the thing that we need to do at that moment. Long term, though, it is so disastrous on human health, in terms of heart, in terms of raising blood sugar levels and blood
Yeah.
pressure,
Yeah.
and
Because
you can
stress is far more than a mental space. That mental space becomes the
yeah,
physical space, and that physical space begins to really show up in all arenas of your life, because you
yeah,
live in stress. Now you have high blood pressure. Now you have, as you said, maybe your sugar loads are off. Maybe it's creating anxiety. Maybe it's creating depression. All of these really, again, this world is very reflective in nature. And if we're not handling our mental capacity, our physical world will start to show
yeah,
that, that you need to let go of some things. You need to get in control of the things you can control, and let go of the things that you can't. And your body's going to start showing up and saying, now you have this problem, and now this is going to be an issue, and now you have IBS, and now you have
yeah,
chronic fatigue, and now you have, and as you clear stress out of your life, those things start to dissipate, believe it or not.
yeah,
And because I know I'm proof of that, and I know that you're proof of that in a lot of arenas. Whenever we let go of these perceived controls and begin controlling the things that we can control, our body has a really high response level to that. And it does take a little time, but it does happen. It's
yeah.
very clear.
Yeah, and it can be different time levels for people, because actually my second bout of burnout, it took me 3 years to recover from the very, and it was a big impact, because
Yeah.
it got to the point where I had chronic fatigue, and I know now, with my the type of personality I've got, and the way that I drive myself, and the way that I work, and the way that I approached motherhood, there were many components in there that were conducive to just you're going to experience stress,
Yeah.
because
Stress is
it's factor.
natural. Yeah.
But
I've had, my fair share of stress, and I've noticed that the way I handle it has changed significantly, and it is an override. It's like, I don't know how else to describe it. It's like an override system that you can put into place, and it takes time, and it
it's more
takes,
automatic now.
yeah, and it takes time, and it's a focused effort, but we deserve, and I always tell people that you deserve this, because you deserve to override these facilities that are not working in your favor. And the more we can come back to self, and the more we can be aware of self, and the more we can establish our own set of guidelines, not what everybody else has told us or conditioned us to believe over our life, because we are unique, that the more we can trust in that process, the better you're going to handle your stress. It is okay for you to feel stressed. Life is stressful. It becomes stressful. There's moments where my dogs stress me out, because they're just high need. And I'm not a, you know, naturally a dog person. I'm more of a cat person, you know, come to me and I'll pet you and then go do your thing, you know, and dogs don't respond to in that way. They're like, love me, all the time. And so, you know, that can cause my stress. But then I realized that it is outside of my control. What I can control is my response to the animals. So, okay, you need to be fed more nurturing support. I will give you more nurturing support. But when I can't give it to you, we've got to establish a boundary there because animals respond to you as well. And just
Yeah.
allow that to be part of the way you move forward. What can I not control? Well, I can't control their needy behavior. What can I control? My response to their needy behavior, and the stress levels automatically start coming down. Okay.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah.
That's a simple way of, you know, that's just my simplistic form of the things that cause me stress now, because I've really done a lot of work in my stress. I have the same existence. I have the same life. I have the same stressors that approach me all the time.
But your response is different.
My response is so different now that I reside in the center of the will 99% of the time. And when I have to come out of that center of the will, it's with purpose. And my body can now recover from it much quicker. Like you, it took me 2.5 years to fully recover my body from the level of stress I lived in for so long. I had chronic fatigue like nobody's business. My lupus was acting up. My IBS was acting up, and I was exhausted. And it took over 2 years for me to finally reach spaces that said, oh, I have the energy to do this. And even like my kids missing the bus wasn't causing an undue amount of stress because I didn't have to carry all of that weight to even get in the car and drive him to school anymore. You know, now it's like, oh, okay, this happened. Cool, whatever. Let's get in the car, take you to school, and I'll come back and it's done. And I don't have to sit in that stress anymore. It's eye-opening and life-changing.
And I think when you've been to the point of where your system actually stops functioning well, because they reckon that, you know, it's been going on for at least 7 years before your system gets to that point of where you start to develop some serious illness. So even though I had a set of symptoms that looked like, you know, MI or, you know, chronic fatigue, that the outcome of that actually shifting for a while, I thought, well, that's it. You know, I am consistently exhausted, need to sleep and can't function. And I think the turnaround for me, and I think anyone who's in that position where they're developing an autoimmune issue, or they've got a chronic fatigue experience and they're sleeping a lot and they've got no energy and they're lethargic, having your vitality robbed of you in your day-to-day life is really, really difficult experience to have. And sometimes the demands are still there. You know, I still children to take to school and bills to pay and things to cook and, you know, bits of work to do. And I did go back to work too early, I know that. So that's really difficult when you get to that place. But what I do know, in terms of all the things that we talk about in terms of tools that can help people, is the things that I started to apply were over long term, because you don't, sometimes you take away the thing that has been stressing you. So for some people that can be a partner, it can be the job, it can be a relative that you've been looking after that's sick. But I was reading some research that for people who've been living with, who have someone who's got dementia, when that person's passed, the average time span for them to recover and not be stressed or fatigued or ill is 18 months. So our 2 to 3 year period sits within a sort of average timeline. And I remember when I removed the stress that was going on the second time, because I'd barely recovered from it the first time, I had about a 2-year window before it hit me really hard. And when I removed it, was an external stress at the time. And I thought I was just going to bounce up and recover, and I didn't. And that was a real shock. And it took me a long time. I was never able to go back in the gym and work out like I did. And actually, it was crazy at the time because I was still trying to work out to the same degree that I was working out with all of those other stresses.
We are slaves to our routines, you know. We can't really do that to ourselves.
Yeah.
So, what are some good ways for people to, I mean, we can do our research on our own and look up long-term stress and do all of these things. But what are some impactful ways
Yeah.
to handle stress as it comes up in the moment, as we are trying to rewire
So,
ourselves?
so the first thing is, if you're in a crisis and you've got to respond, that is very different from
Right.
the day-to-day stuff. And the day-to-day stuff, as we've already said, we'll experience it in different ways for a variety of reasons. Either it is a big thing, and we've lost our jobs and all the bills are piling up and all that. Of course, that's going to be stressful.
Right.
One of the things to look at is actually what needs we've got, what needs aren't being met. So is it that we've got an overemphasis on work, but we're not having enough play? Is it that we are trying to balance absolutely everything in our lives and we need to ask for help? Is it that, we need to create a new budget so that we can get on track and not worry about this all the time? So first of all is looking at the needs and what's missing in your life, because also that is very key when looking at anxiety and depression as well. So depression can be an experience of this accumulated stress that your
Mhm.
body is so exhausted. You do have to go to sleep and you have to let go in those moments. And you don't want to get so ill that you do end up needing to seek, psychological support or in-house treatment, because that's the end, the end result. We don't want people to get to that phase. So that's the sort of the big stuff. What can help if you tend to feel stress on a day-to-day basis? Are you working so hard at what you're doing, whether that is parenting at home or the job that you've got? And what is it that's creating that stress? And sometimes what can help is that you have a journal. So you log in the day where you're feeling calm, relaxed, in control, able to manage your work. And then you'll start to look at what parts of the day that stress increases. If you've got something to compare it with, some people, like I gave the example of where they get a new job, it may well be that you have to do some self-talk and say, of course it's stressful when you start a new job, as exciting as it is, because I'm going through a growth period. And it's a
Yeah.
bit like when you just had a baby. I would say to new mothers, this is a transition. They won't always be waking you up 5 times in the night. They won't always be disturbing your sleep. It's a state and a transition that you're going through. So how can you buffer against that? What things can you drop? What actions that you deploy are detrimental to you in this time period? And then what are your coping mechanisms? If your coping mechanisms are taking drugs, illegal or otherwise, or drinking, there's only a short-term benefit of that. And it may well be that you need to look at, is it that I need to talk to somebody? Is it that I'm lacking resources and tools? Is it that actually I did learn that it was modelled in the way that you talked about with my family? So having a journal to log your experiences and see where the pinch points are in your day, if you're getting them. If it's chronic stress, you do really, it is useful to go and talk to somebody else. The
Yes.
key thing that's going out of all the research, and I bang on about this pretty much in every arena I'm in and every podcast we do, is you have to learn to breathe again. Because the thing with
Yeah.
stress is you'll hold your breath, you'll hold it at the top. And I didn't realise when I was at a really stressful point in work, I used to be sat on the laptop like that, banging away at the keys, and then go, not realising I'm not
Not
actually taking
realizing,
any.
yeah, you've basically been holding your breath or doing
Yeah,
short breaths, and our bodies need us to have a consistent, deeper
flow
breath.
of oxygen.
Yeah, because
Yeah,
it does. It reflects in the way, like, you feel tight now, your body feels tight. Now your brain is
yeah,
slowly but surely frenzying
yeah,
because it's starting to shut itself down and you're not thinking as clear. And in that moment that you take the deep breath, it's like, oh, I'm here and now again.
yeah. So
Yeah.
if you're in a stressful environment, for example, whether you're at home with the kids running around, or living in a hustle and bustle family, or you're at work, what the research is showing is that you don't just do one thing a week. You don't just go to a spa one day a week and then the rest of the time you just remain in stress. You've got to start applying consistent changes in behaviour. So it might be that you do one thing, and one of the things I say to people that can be quite key is that you just find 5 minutes a few times in the day to focus on your breath. to start taking in smooth, deep breaths. And if you don't know how to do that, there's so much on YouTube now and so many sites given to some really basic relaxation skills.
Right.
And it isn't necessarily to get you into a meditative zone so that you wear a sheet and go and sit in a temple all day. This is about reorientating yourself. When you talk about the wheel and the chaos, and the interesting thing is, if you wake up in the morning and you're already getting floods of thoughts about stress, it's because you went to bed thinking about all that stuff. So your brain will sort of take you back to where you were the previous night. What Abraham Hicks talked about a lot in every one of their talks and videos is you only have about 15 seconds when you wake up in terms of all the thoughts that are coming into your head to choose whether or not you hook into the stress thoughts of what kind of day is it going to be. I hope she's not going to be at work because that was horrible yesterday. I've got that. It only takes about 15 seconds. And it's a bit like the egg timer. All of a sudden, if you allow that thought process to kick in, then all of those thoughts will flood in, a bit like the sand flooding in. And you will then have every other thought and every other stress and every conversation that is irritates you. And Dave didn't do this and Susie didn't do that. And and all of these internal conversations will come in. If you wake up and you're feeling it, you do have a window of opportunity to work on your state management. NLP talks about this all the time. You stand up and you breathe into your body and you ground yourself through whatever method, and you look out your window and you aim to look at something that is pleasing to the eye. You put stickers around your mirror if you need reminders of positive quotes, pictures that you had taken with people of really, really beautiful times. You went away, you went out for dinner with them, you did all these different things. So you put these things around, you have your journey, and that is just the start of the day. That's the first step. And they're basic things that you can do, but we're sort of moving into the behavior management now. This is about creating new habits.
Well, so, and what I keep hearing from you is, how much control we really do have inside of this, and what feels like we're vulnerable and victimized in our existence could actually be the thing that you can grasp control of. So when you're falling asleep at night, practice, hey, let's redirect the thought, right? Let's redirect the thought. Let's get into a more neutral to positive environment as I'm falling asleep, so that when I wake up, I'm not naturally waking up into where I fell asleep at. When I wake up, say I couldn't overcome that last night, I'm going to make it a point today to overcome that. And even if the flooding of thoughts that are all negative come through, we are in control of saying, let's redirect that thought, and doing it in whatever form it looks like to you. For you, it's standing up, grounding, looking at something beautiful or something that's inspiring to you, right? Others, it could be that they can take control and say, well, yeah, okay, I woke up with this conversation in my head, but instead I'm going to think about what I'm grateful for in my existence, and redirect that way. Mel and I are not saying that this is easy work, but we are saying this is work that's worth it. And it's worth it in a very real way. And it's worthy of you taking the effort that you do, the same amount of effort you're using to stress yourself out. You can redirect that into improving yourself, becoming more self-actualized, becoming more self-aware, and being in that moment. And some of the things that I do is the breath work, and that can be as simple as everybody at this point has pretty much heard of box breathing. We also have different forms of that. It's I call it the 5 by 5 by 5, which is breathe in for 5 seconds, you hold for 5 seconds, you release it for 5 seconds, and you do that 3 times. And then immediately you can clap, you can snap your fingers, you can let out an audible laugh, you can have your thought patterns become something new. And it really does help you override the natural position you are in the moment, and give you back your control over self, because that is the one thing we really can control is ourself. And it's not easy for everybody, but it's also, if it was easy, everybody would be leading a stress-free experience. And that's just not the case. So again, this isn't easy, but it's worth it. And we are deserving of this. And we deserve to have a freer thought process, a clearer mind, and a body that's not rejecting the negative and toxic thoughts that are going on. We are deserving of living a life that remains in the center of the will, because it is up and down, and you're going to come across stressors, and you're going to come across things almost daily that can send you spiraling. And it is our job as an individual to say, I deserve not to spiral anymore, and then do whatever it takes to stop spiraling in as healthy of a pattern as you can do.
Yeah. And I think your key point is that if you're feeling really stressed, then whether you're at overwhelm or you're just feeling that stress built up, because it depends on how aware you are to start with, you need to sit back and focus on your breath and work on just letting things go for that time period, so that you can start to, if you haven't experienced it before, you will start with practice to experience more peace, more calmness. Because if you haven't felt it for a while, or ever felt it at all, peace, calm, neutrality, then it's very difficult to know why say focusing on your breath, chanting, doing some yoga is actually beneficial.
Right.
But if we think that our systems from the moment we wake up till we go to sleep are constantly being sparked and activated, and in particular, if we're getting really hyper aroused because we've had a conversation with somebody that often this is to do with past relationships will trigger us, our system is going into a constant state of hyper arousal. We owe it to ourselves to learn some basic techniques. And that it can be 5-5-5, it can be 7-11. I think the 5-5-5 is probably better, because if you've not been breathing well for a while, it's actually quite hard to breathe in for and that's how it needs to be done. And it takes it takes about 3 breaths at least to switch the I think it's parasympathetic nervous system over to the sympathetic nervous system, which enables us to now release endorphins rather than stress chemicals. And so with that constant practice, and again, it's refocus your mind in the morning in terms of creating the state that you want. Apply anything at all in your environment that will help elicit good feelings to remind you, because we need reminders. Have some points in the day, even if it's once every couple of hours, where you just put a timer on your phone and then remind you to sit back and focus on your breathing. Because when you take that focus onto your breath, you can notice whether or not you've been holding your breath, or whether or not you start yawning a lot, when you do that. And then start to put some practice in your week, whether that is going for a walk in nature, because nature itself, in terms of that environment, will dissipate some of that chaos that is in our aura. Because if we've got that in our energetic field, we are going to notice and see more stress around us.
Yeah. Well, and the Earth's pulse is a natural healer, like there's science backing grounding, and and the way it discharges the negative ions. And so this is a real thing. Like, there's science backing this. This isn't some esoterical, my connection to spirit was founded on me needing science backed. And I didn't want to be too far over into some, non-reality that's here. But yeah, so we are going to be tackling a lot, but you're also going to notice that Mel and I are going to have a lot of the same advice. And the reason why is because it works. Because these things that we do, these consistent behaviors, the breathing, the yoga, the NLP, all of the things that we sound like,
they're really powerful.
They're powerful, and they're powerful and simple. And that's sometimes the best way to go about it.
It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? That actually, and I thought that for years. I was like, these are really simple things, and yet they're tackling some really complex issues. And if it's really hard to shift out of negative states because they're chronic, then you really do need to go and talk to somebody that will listen to you, but also help you develop some tools that you can apply right now. Because it's a bit like when people say to me, oh, we really need to get fit. Well, they don't go to the gym, so why am I going to advise them to go and work out for an hour and be on the cross trainer for 50 minutes and lift weights at twice the weights of what they would even be able to lift now. It's too much for the body. So you need to introduce people to bite-sized things that they can do. If you're in a really stressful situation, and when that's over, often going to sleep and having time out will make a big difference. Immersing yourself in a film or something. So it depends on if it's chronic and it's been going on a long time and you're not seeing the red flags, but people are. You need to listen and do something about that. There's no shame in asking for help. It is a human experience that we have. Coaching's quite good because coaching can sometimes help you zoom in on those. If you research the coaching wheel, you'll see that it's a circle with slices taken out like a pizza, and each component, each part of that pizza will be a component of your life: children, religion, spirituality, work, finances, all of that. And you can have a look at which aspect of your life is maybe creating more stress, or it might be generalized stress. People can have generalized anxiety, but not really know what that is. So first of all, accept it's normal, accept what you're feeling, accept what's happening right now. Have a look at what you control, exactly what you said, and what you can't. What can you do with something right now? If you're overwhelmed because you've got 15 things on your list, choose the top 3 that if you did them, they would make a difference. If you sit there and procrastinate all day and you're not tackling anything, it can be quite a nice feeling when at least you've got one thing off your list. And if you know that does feel nice, that will motivate you to do it next. Find time for yourself. Don't over agree to doing social activities, and that this will pass, and trust it will pass, and trust that when you start to apply things that that is rooted in the evidence, which is changing your mindset, learning some CBT techniques. What were you thinking? Okay, I can't do this job. What were you feeling? Powerless and impotent. What behavior did it lead to? It made you look hunched over and people treated you differently. You change your thought, you change your feeling, you can change the behavior. But it's all practice. And me and you have talked about how much we have had to personally practice to make these things. I wasn't born up in a family like this. I've had to learn a lot of the things that I've been now teaching.
Even as naturally inclined as you and I are to this mental plane that we can live in, and how we make the improvements and being self-aware and self-actualized, it still takes work to override a system designed and then conditioned inside of society. And so, we're powerful beings. Take your power back, take your control back, acknowledge yourself for who you are, and be as nice to yourself as you possibly can be through these transitions, because it can become, instead of an outward stress, it then can become something that's very detrimental to your well-being by judging your human experience. We are humans. We are here to experience, and nobody gave us the guidelines of how we're supposed to experience this world. So be gentle with yourself as you are coming through these crossroads, through these transitionary times, and be okay with change, because that is something that is constant, is change. Mel, thank you so much. I love listening to you talk. You are just filled with wisdom and information. And I'm so grateful that it's me that I get to have the experience with.
Well, equally, Danielle, I have exactly the same experience with you, and it's a joy that we're working together. And I appreciate this, because had we not both done the work, I think it would have been a very difficult, or may not have even happened, transition.
May not even happen for us. Yeah, I agree. And so proof is here. And we are proof of this, and you guys can be proof of this too. Just go and shine, you stars, you beautiful starlights. Let's just get this happening. But until next time, I hope that everybody's mental health and well-being continues to be on a consistent uprise. You are deserving of it.
Excellent. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Mel. There she is. Okay. Oh, you're still recording.